not quite as familiar with it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about unpacking the scoring rubrics. Then Andrea is going to talk with us about the different types of writing and how and when you know when to do what type of writing, and give you some tips for analyzing your videos. So that's where we're headed this afternoon. Just as a brief review for component 3 for all certification areas, you start off with a brief introduction to entry form, and that is just to give the assessor a quick glimpse at what you're going to be submitting. And then the rest of the information that you submit will be in 2 packets, one for each video. So you will be preparing 2 video segments that are each about 10 to 15 minutes in length. And for each video, you're going to have a separate packet of information. You'll start out with the instructional context sheet, which will tell the assessor a little bit about the class that you used for the video and your teaching context. Then you'll have the instructional planning form, which has some questions on it that you answer about your class once again. And most importantly, you attach to that a 2-page write-up of how you plan that video. And you'll want to be sure and look in your component instructions for the writing about planning questions. A lot of candidates miss them, and it's important that you answer them for that instructional planning paper. That is separate from the written commentary questions. To your instructional planning form, you'll also attach up to 3 instructional materials for each video. These are generally not completed student work samples. Rather, they are materials that will help the assessor understand the instruction that they're seeing on the video. So for example, if you're teaching in a brick and mortar classroom, you may have an anchor chart on the wall that's not visible in the video, but the students refer to it. So you could include a photograph of that chart. Or you might have a rubric that you're going to use to assess the student's work, or a copy of the assignment that they're working on. Any of those types of things would be examples of instructional materials that might help the assessor to understand the instruction on the video and that you might want to attach. And finally, you'll have a written commentary of 4 pages for each video. And that's not really very much space to analyze each video, just 4 pages. So you're really going to have to put some thought into that and think about doing it in a concise manner. And Andrea's going to give you some good tips for that later on. If you're more of a visual person like I am, there's a link to a graphic at the bottom of the slide that presents that same information in graphic form. When you're completing your videos, or rather when you're planning your videos, you're going to want to keep in mind some of the rules that are specific to component 3. First of all, each video needs to be a different instructional format. And your component 3 instructions will provide you with a list of format choices. Generally, it's whole group instruction, small group instruction, a laboratory setting, or one-on-one. And then there's some language about, or anything else that's appropriate for your setting. So it's pretty wide open. We suggest that your instructional formats are different for each video, as different as possible, so that the assessor can get a good idea of your flexibility in instruction. One of the candidates in our January 27th webinar asked if you can start out each video whole group and then move into small group. You can do that, but I would caution you that if you're just giving directions or something like that in the whole group portion, to think about whether or not you're really engaging your students actively during that whole group format. Before you break into the small groups. If not, you may want to do one video that is whole group the entire time that shows how you engage your students in a whole group setting, both with each other and with you. But that's up to you. The main point I want to make is that your instructional formats do need to be different in the videos. You also need to select different instructional units for each video, because again, the assessor wants to see the depth and breadth of your instructional planning ability. So you're going to want to choose different instructional units with different distinct objectives. And I recommend that you choose a unit that's quite manageable, that's maybe a week or 2 in length, because you're going to want to address how you know whether or not your students met the stated objectives. You also want to focus on different instructional strategies in each video. Sometimes we have candidates who ask about submitting a video using a certain instructional strategy in a whole group format, and then using the same instructional strategy in a small group format. And I would caution you against doing this because that's really not different instructional strategies. And again, you want to show your flexibility as an instructor and your knowledge of pedagogy of how to teach your content. So you're going to want to choose different instructional strategies for each video and justify why they are appropriate for your students for these objectives at this point in time. Additionally, if you're an early childhood generalist or a middle childhood generalist, each video is going to focus on a different content area, and you'll choose from math, science, or social studies. So if your first video is math, then your second one would have to be science or social studies. Again, we've had candidates ask, why can't they do literacy if they're an early childhood or middle childhood generalist for component 3? And the answer is because literacy is the focus for component 2. So that only applies, once again, to our elementary generalists. Your videos should be as different from each other as possible. You and your students both want to be doing different things for very purposeful reasons. And as I mentioned before, you're going to want to justify in your writing about planning paper why you chose these instructional strategies in this format to teach these objectives to these students. You obviously are the expert in teaching your content, and you may forget to provide the why. Why did you choose to do it this way? Your assessor is also an expert in your content area, and you may think, well, the assessor knows why I'm doing this. And that's probably very true, but the assessor cannot give you credit for using best practices unless you explain very explicitly why you're doing what you're doing. So be sure and include that type of analysis of why and how you planned it when you're writing your writing about planning paper. You'll see when you look in your instructions that on page 1 or maybe 2 of your component instructions is a list of the National Board standards that are assessed for component 3 for your certification area. I suggest that you review them and highlight items that are pertinent to your component 3 expectations. And keep in mind those items that you've highlighted as you're planning, teaching, and writing this component. Because remember, the scoring rubrics that you're going to be assessed on are based on those standards. So it's certainly worth your time to go into that standards document, which I realize is a big ask. It might be 75 pages, but it's well worth your time to go in there and pick out the standards that are assessed for this component and refresh your memory on what the expectation is for accomplished teaching for your certification area for those standards, and make sure that you're reflecting that as you plan, teach, and write this component. As I mentioned, the scoring rubrics are based on the standards. You probably also already know that National Board assesses everything that you submit on a 4-point scale. Levels 3 and 4 are considered accomplished practice, and levels 1 and 2 are considered to be not yet accomplished. In order to achieve certification, you're going to want to achieve overall an average in the 3 or 4 range of at least 2.75, which is a 3 minus. So it's still in that accomplished range. That doesn't mean you have to have a 2.75 or above on every single component, because some may be higher than that and some might be lower, and it would all average out to be sufficient for you to achieve certification. But you certainly want to strive for the level 3 and 4 scores. You'll see when you look at the scoring rubrics that the bullet points for each level are about the same. What's different is the quantity and quality of evidence that are required for each of those bullet points to meet the level 3 or 4. As I mentioned, on average, you're going to need to achieve 2.75 or above, which is a 3 minus. There's a handy score calculator on the National Board website. You see the link on your screen. And again, that link will be in the slide deck when you receive it on Monday. And if you have already received scores for some of your components, you can put those scores into the score calculator and then experiment with different scores that you might receive on this component to see what impact that will have on your overall score. If you haven't received any scores yet, then you can certainly input scores for all of your components and get a feel for how a change in your score can impact your overall chance of certification. As Lisa mentioned, component 3 is worth 30% of your overall score. So you certainly want to be sure that you have adequate time to devote to component 3 if you're planning on attempting it this year. You're also going to want to look in the scoring guide and read all about the scoring process. That's not where the scoring rubrics are. They're in your component instructions. But the scoring guide gives you all the nitty-gritty on how the scores are computed. And it also talks about the minimum floor scores. A lot of times candidates are confused by those minimum floor scores. It's not enough to simply achieve above the minimum. You have to achieve much higher than that in order to achieve certification. And you can certainly read more about that by looking in the scoring guide at the link shown on your screen. Now we're going to take a look at some of the scoring rubrics. On your screen, you see a sample of that little gray box that's at the top of the Level 4 scoring rubric for Early Childhood Generalist. And you can see that I highlighted for you in yellow, the Level 4 performance is characterized by clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. What are some of the things that are mentioned in this box that is straight from the Level 4 scoring rubric that you need to consider when you're planning your video in order to achieve at the Level 4 level? If you would, just enter something in the chat box that jumps out at you from the text on the screen that you need to keep in mind as you're planning a Level 4 response for clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. So I see people entering lots of good comments. The environment needs to be safe, fair, equitable, and supportive, and challenging. And there needs to be active engagement of young children with the teacher and with each other in relevant topics. So thank you for sharing that information with us. That's a very meaty paragraph. And no matter what your certification area is, be sure that you spend some time looking in that little gray box at the top of the scoring rubric. On the next page, we see a Level 3 sample, and this is from middle school and high school science. And you'll see that the identifying characteristic is that Level 3 is looking for clear evidence. And once again, even though this is totally a different age group and a different certification area, we see some of the same descriptors. Safe, fair, and equitable and challenging environment, active engagement of students with the teacher and with each other as they're exploring significant scientific concepts. So again, there's a lot of meat in that box that you're going to want to consider as you're planning your component and as you're analyzing both your written work and your video, because there's a lot there. When you look at component 2, you see that that is characterized by limited evidence. I know when I'm working with candidates who have received a score and not achieved certification and perhaps not been happy with their score, we talk about the different items that are listed for the different bullets in the scoring rubric. And they say, well, Linda, I know I put that in there, but maybe they just mentioned it one time, which the assessor may well consider to be limited evidence of whatever that bullet point is. But again, the gray box at the top of that rubric is still looking for a safe, fair, equitable, and supportive and challenging environment, active engagement, and this is a music rubric, so developing musicianship and sharing skills and ideas. So again, those are some of the differences that you need to be thinking about in the different levels of these rubrics. Lisa shared a wonderful activity with us that is an example of what you'll see if you check out that scoring rubric or excuse me, scoring webinar from January 28th that we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. We find that a lot of candidates who do not achieve certification achieve a score of 2 on this or other components. So we suggest that you print out your level 2 and 3 scoring rubrics and lay them down side by side, or you can do it on your screen if you prefer, and compare it one by one bullet point on the level 2 to the corresponding bullet point on the level 3, excuse me. And you can see on the next slide what that'll look like. And as you make that comparison, you'll begin to see some of the differences in the language for what the expectations are for the difference in a component 2 and a component 3 product. So go ahead and when you do this exercise, maybe underline the words in level 2 that are different and highlight the words in level 3 so they'll jump out at you, and you'll know that you want to strive for those more engaging or active verbs or adjectives or adverbs that are in the level 3 rubric, because that's going to bump you up to a clear evidence of those items as opposed to limited evidence. And then after you do that, we suggest that you compare level 3 and 4 and do the same thing, because you want to move toward that level 4 rubric if possible. And finally, we have an example of the level 1 rubric. This one happens to be from the counseling certification area. And you can see that the level 1 work is characterized by little or no evidence for the information in the gray box, which we've seen before, as well as each one of those bullet points that are listed under that gray box on the level 1 rubric. So, you know, we often say, look at the level 4 rubric because that's what you're striving for. But I think you also want to look at the level 1, because to me, it jumps out at you if something is vague or missing from your paper that you're going to have a level 1. That's what my facilitator told me to look at and think about when I went through the process 20 years ago. And I think that was really good advice. The level 1 rubric is not quite as verbose as the level 4 rubric, and sometimes it jumps out at you a little bit more strongly, that you need to be sure that you have those elements in your component. Let's talk a little bit about how you can make your evidence clear, consistent, and convincing, because those are the key words that the assessor will be focusing on for the level 4 performance. So think about what is going to make your writing and everything that you submit clear. Remember, the assessor can get evidence for your score from everything that you submit. So it can come from your videos, from your forms, from the attachments, from those papers that you write about planning, and from your written commentary. So what can you do to make your evidence clear? I think that one thing you can do that we recommend to our candidates is have someone outside the field of education read your paper. And if they can understand it, then that means you probably have explained yourself well enough for the assessor to understand. If you use jargon or abbreviations that may not be common practice throughout the country, be sure and define those abbreviations or those terms that may not be familiar to the assessor the first time that you use them in this component. Even if you define the terms in another component, remember a different assessor is assessing component 3 than the person who assessed your other components. So you need to define your terms once in each component to make sure that the assessor understands what you're talking about. Because what we're doing in North Carolina and Charlotte may be totally different than what you're doing in Wyoming. And you don't know where your assessor is coming from. So you want to be sure that they understand what you're doing. Also, I think one thing that I recommend to candidates is pretend that you are writing to a College of Ed student who's observing in your classroom as a part of their college coursework. And maybe they've never been in a classroom other than as a student. And you're having to explain to them why and how you're planning everything the way you did. And that hopefully will make your writing clear. You also want your writing to be convincing. And I think that if you put in a lot of specific examples, naming students by their first names, that will help make your work convincing. Think about if you're sitting in a planning meeting with your colleagues and maybe one of them has just completed a book study or an online course where they used a new strategy to teach your content. And they're telling you about it, and you may be thinking, yeah, there's something new comes along every few months. I'm not really interested in trying that. And you may or may not try it. But if they give you specific examples of, I did this strategy last Tuesday in my classroom, and Johnny, who has never before been able to do this, he finally understood it and was able to do it, then you might be more convinced that this is something you want to try, because your colleague gave you a specific example using a real life student. So I encourage you to use specific examples in your writing as much as you have room for, using your students' first names. For example, if you're explaining how or why you made certain instructional decisions based on your knowledge of students or your knowledge of how to teach your content area, name your students. I planned this way because I know my English learner students, Maria and Jose, will need this support. And I know Randy, who is learning disabled, is going to need this other support. Name your students when you're explaining why and how you made those instructional decisions. What are some other things that you can think of that you can do in your writing to make your evidence convincing? Share your ideas in the chat box. What can you do to make your evidence convincing? Okay, I've seen some good examples down there. Give specific classroom interactions, not just generalities and things like that. And you all can continue to read those as they scroll through the chat box. So thank you for sharing them. Let's look a little bit at how to make your evidence consistent. Because remember, level 4 wants clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. So consistency to me means that you do it more than once. As you go through the bullet points in your scoring rubric, think about the fact that most of those bullet points refer directly to one or more of the standards that are assessed for this component. And you're going to want to address each portion of each bulleted topic multiple times if you have room to do so. Remember, you only have 2 pages to write about how you planned each video and 4 pages to write about how you analyzed your instruction for each video. So I know your space is limited, but the more examples you can give of how and why you do what you do, the more consistent the assessor will see that that is part of your practice. For example, if you're being asked to give examples of how your knowledge of students or your use of assessment data informs your instructional planning, you're going to want to give multiple examples of that in order to show that it's a consistent part of your practice. As you are editing your papers, and maybe some of you who've already started working on this have begun writing your papers, then you're going to want to spend some time editing your work. And one suggestion we have for you is to use a separate color to highlight for each bullet point in the rubric. So for example, you might use a pink highlighter to go through your papers and highlight all the instances where you talked about using knowledge of students to plan your instruction. And you might want to use blue to highlight examples of how you used assessment data or assessment results to plan your instruction, and so on. I think oftentimes when we're working on these papers and maybe working on more than one component, we think we've included something, but perhaps we had it in there at one point in time, but we had to edit it out because we're over our page limit. So I think it really helps to go through and actually find your writing in your paper and make sure that it's still there to show that you consistently do those things that are in the scoring rubric. And our final slide about the scoring rubrics is an example from Exceptional Needs Specialist, or ENS. And this is an example from the level 4 rubric. And again, they're looking for clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. And this is just one of the bullet points. But they're looking for evidence that the teacher monitors and evaluates student progress and learning, making instructional adjustments as needed. So that may be something that you write about in your planning paper. It may also be something that you write about in your written commentaries as you're analyzing your videos. Maybe you noticed that some of your students were confused during the video. What did you do about that? Did you ask open-ended questions during the video recorded lessons to gauge their level of understanding? Did you listen in on conversations among student groups to see if they were discussing the topic at hand and showing that they were demonstrating mastery of the objectives? So those are all ways that you can be monitoring and assessing them on an ongoing basis. And then the last part of that bullet point is about how do you provide regular feedback to your students? Did you provide feedback to them during the video? Did you provide feedback to them after the video? Did you provide feedback to them in the lesson before the video? Those are all things that you can think about and write about in these papers to bump that up to a level 4 performance that shows clear, consistent, and convincing evidence. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, who's going to talk with us about writing.
Right, great information from Linda, all about those scoring rubrics and finding those places within your video that you can really highlight to prove what's happening in your video and how you planned that intentionally. I'm going to share some types of writing that can really help amplify some of those ideas that you see in your video and pull out some of those things that can make it more clear, more convincing, and finding all of that evidence that you can find. Those 3 types of writing are description, analysis, and reflection. And this little chart in here kind of shows how much of each might be helpful in terms of your paper. So these aren't exact percentages and they will kind of come and go, but thinking about proving your evidence in a clear and convincing way, you're gonna really have to analyze every single thing that went on in that video. So that's why analysis definitely holds a big bulk of the percentages in the types of writing that you might be thinking of. When you think about description writing, that's gonna be some of those planning ideas, some of those things that you find in the forms of your writing, and starting to think about some of those keywords that you're looking for as you really just describe what the assessor is seeing. And remember that you want this to be very clear when you're sharing the description of what's happening. So that includes things like why you set up the environment the way you did, why you used the graphic organizers or the worksheets or the instruction that you did. All of the things that talks about what you did and how you did it, that's going to be really in the description of what's happening. Again, a lot of the description questions that are gonna start with questions about list or state or describe or what you did or which of these ideas that you worked with, those are most likely going to be found in your forms. So I would say start with your forms in component 3 and make sure that you're really describing all of the things that happen in your classroom. Describe the atmosphere, describe the learning that's happening, and that's where that description is really going to come in. Now, remember that you don't want to describe the videos in detail. They do not want to see a play-by-play action of every single thing that's going on in the video. The boy got up and the boy moved to the wall, and then the girl stood over here, and you're going to want to describe what was intentional. What really proves that you know your students? What really proves that you know your content? How are you going to be able to prove that you are doing things in a systematic way? And so that's where the description is going to come into play. And you're going to be able to read a little bit more about the description in your general portfolio directions. So take a look at that if you want to know a little bit more about how to use description. So an example of a description on the next slide is going to just kind of give us a quick blip of what an example of a description might be. And I'll go ahead and let you read that. But thinking about this as an example from a component 3 to kind of describe different setting that might be happening in the classroom. So when you look at this, Does this make sense to what you saw in your video as an example of a description? Give you a minute just to read it. So it's talking about many students faced difficulty in pacing, right? And so as you start to read this example of a description, you're going to be able to see this is setting the stage for what's going to happen later in the paper. This description is kind of giving the overview, things that you intentionally thought of and pulled out as you were planning this lesson to happen. And you're describing it because it happened the way that it's seen on the video, or what happened before the video that the assessor can't see, or describing what happened after the video also, which the assessor can't see. And so now we're going to start to analyze all of these descriptions, and we're going to be able to say, did this work for my students? Did this meet my goals and objectives for the lesson? This is where you're going to see all of those keywords of how and why and in which ways, and you're going to provide that rationale. You're going to be able to really dive in and say, when I did this, I saw my students do this, and that's how I know that it worked. Or when I did this, I saw my students weren't able to do this. So here's how I modified. So you're really analyzing those key components, whether it's student to student interaction, student to teacher interaction, or just the flow of the lesson that's going on. You're going to be able to say how and why all of those instructional decisions happened. Now, some of those instructional decisions might not have happened or occurred within that video or even within this school year, but you're going to be able to talk about years back when you started teaching and you learned that students work best in a group of 3 and how you really got to know that. And so that's why your groups are working in groups of 3 right now. So you can even analyze based on prior teaching experience that has formed you into the teacher that you are today. So start to think about this. If you had a student teacher in your classroom and you had to tell them all of the reasons you did things in your classroom every day, what would you tell them? And why would those things be important as they moved into setting up their classrooms in the future? And so starting to think about how you're going to analyze is really that meat. Again, we talked about more than 50% of your paper, because that's going to be all of those nitty gritty things, all of those hows and whys. And this is where you're going to grab all of that evidence. This is where you're going to be able to say, when I heard the student say this, and you can provide that exact example of what you heard. This is how I responded, or this is how I altered my lesson. You're going to be able to say, when these 2 students were talking and I heard the misunderstanding, here's what I did. And so that analysis is going to be critical. You can pull ideas from your analysis straight from your video. So those of you who have already videotaped, and 30% of you have, so great job. Start thinking as you watch that video, what are those things that you can pull out that you can say, this worked? This is how I know it worked. What are those things when you watch your video and you're going to be able to say, this is how I set it up, and this is how I'm seeing its success. And so I'm being able to say, this is really working for my students, and this is how I can see it happening in my classroom. The next slide is going to give you an example of some analysis, and it's going to be a description of exactly what happened in a classroom. And you can find more examples in your journal portfolio directions that's going to really illustrate how to analyze all of the instruction that's going on. So I'll give you a minute to look at this. If you find some words in this description of analysis that really help you know that this person who wrote this example, they really are giving you a clear, convincing idea of what happened in their classroom. Type some of those words in the chat. How do you know that this example of analysis is proving what they did or what worked? I see some strong verbs. I see an exact sentence prompt. So again, when you go in and you're looking at your video, because many of you have already started to do that, how are you going to be able to take that exact idea of making those connections with your students, providing that sentence starter of exactly proof of what you saw in that video to start adding in some of that analysis into your video? And the next important piece is using the video analysis questions that are in your portfolio instructions to kind of help you get started. There's going to be some feedback statements in the scoring guide and editing tools. That link is there for you. So the National Boards has already started to give you a little bit of head start on that. And you can see why this is such an important piece of this component. So hopefully you can utilize these tools and avoid the need to have to redo this as a whole component or pieces of this, because you're really analyzing all of this. And so take a look at that reference there as a resource to really help you dive in to find some more ways to analyze your videos there. And then here's an example of what that editing tool might look like, giving you some prompts and some questions to help guide you further in telling what's exactly happening in your video, how to really pull in those key details when you're writing. Because again, we say it, if it happens in the video, but you didn't write about it, it never happened. So making sure that you find all of those little pieces that are happening that might just be like clockwork to you, that you're able to read students' facial expressions, and you do that all the time and you don't think anything of it, but really that guides your instruction every day, making sure that you pull in all of those things that you use without thinking about to make sure that you write about them. Because if you didn't write about it, it didn't happen. I like to say that over and over again. And again, there's a graphic organizer to really help you as you're analyzing your videos. So grab that paper as you're watching your videos. You can start writing down things you hear, things you see, so that when you put it into your paper, you have all of the exact details that are happening in your lesson. Now, the last piece about writing that we're going to talk about today is reflection. Now, reflection, again, is a huge piece of every component of national boards, and is one of the most important parts about being an accomplished teacher, is that reflection that you use every day in your classroom. So when you see things in the component directions that say, what would you do differently? Why would you do things differently? Can you give specifically how you would change this, and to reflect upon the things that are happening in your classroom? This is where that's going to fall in. So being able to not provide vague statements, but to really dive in deep and to be able to say, when I saw this, this is what it made me think of, and this is how I'm going to change that tomorrow to really help the student, and giving very specific ideas that you're going to be able to add in. Now, make sure that you give the reasons why you think things need to be changed. Again, that's going to pull in that convincing evidence. As you see a student maybe make a misconception, you're going to catch that idea from the video and say, oh my gosh, I didn't get it right then and there, but tomorrow, these are the 3 things I'm going to do to really help clear up that, so that my students can reach their goals, and really proving that you are thinking systematically about what you're teaching with your students. The next slide is going to show, again, another example of what a reflection might look like. So as you read over this example of a reflection, what are those key words that you're pulling out that are providing clear, convincing, and evidence that you want to make sure that you add in? How is this example of a reflection going to help you prove everything that's happening in your video? And how will you know that the lesson was either successful or needed to be rethought of? Again, this is an example that you can find in your general portfolio directions. So take a look at these examples as you're starting to write and analyze your video, and you can see, where are those things that I need to beef up? How is my reflection really reflected in my paper? Now, again, some writing tips, kind of just to close us up. Remember that your writing style is not scored, but everything you put into your writing is scored. So make sure that you're adding in as much detail and as much specific information about your students, your lesson, your teaching that you can. Define any abbreviations and acronyms so that you can save space for all of the evidence that you're looking for, and really look for those general portfolio directions to help you find those analysis, description, and reflection prompts. Now, if you don't write about it, it didn't happen, right? And so I keep saying that over and over again, because oftentimes people say, well, it's in the video. The assessor must know exactly what happened because they watched it happen. So I don't need to waste my space and write about that. But again, if you didn't write about it, it didn't happen. So please make sure that you are putting in as much specific detail that's going to prove student outcomes in your writing as you possibly can. Now, again, make sure that you're painting that picture exactly for the assessor about how you set this up, about how you know all of your students and how you're teaching them in a systematic way, and paint that very clear picture for the assessor. Try not to repeat yourself. If you've already set it in a form, the assessor will have read that form and it doesn't need to be repeated in your commentary, and vice versa. So once you've stated it, you're good to go, but then make sure that you provide multiple opportunities of evidence where you can see that it actually happened. The last thing to remember is to make sure that you are clearly explaining and showing what's happening in your classroom. Try not to be negative because we're writing in COVID and we want schools to open, or try not to make anything political. Don't talk negatively about the teacher next door or the parents talking in the background of your student's video. Keep it specific, right? Talk about what you can control, your teaching, your planning, your students. Make sure that you're providing evidence for exactly what happened, and leave all of the opinions about everything else that's happening away. We don't want to waste our space. We want to be intentional and improve all of our teaching and learning with our students. And so again, I want to mention that responding to the writing about planning questions, which is attached to one of the forms, is very critical. Don't miss that piece when you're starting to write about your component. Make sure that you add in those additional 2 pages for writing about planning, because that's often missed. And make sure that you use all the additional space that you possibly can. Provide as much evidence directly from the video as you can as you analyze and reflect on it. I would love to hear maybe from some of you that did record a video. What did you see in that video that provides evidence of student learning? Share some ideas, especially for those of you that are teaching virtual, which is a little bit harder to find that evidence of learning. What did you hear your students say? What did you see through your video that you're going to be able to pull out and add to your writing? And so for those of you who are super brave and recorded a video, I also know that it's not as bad. The more you practice, the better it gets. And so for those of you that are still waiting to videotape that first time, hopefully some of the inspiration from the people who saw great evidence of student learning in their videos will inspire you to take that first step and record your video. Doesn't have to be the one you use, but keep practicing and be brave to show your students what bravery looks like. And hopefully this helps you to really kind of find some ways to analyze, reflect, and describe what's happening, and really pull it all together in a cohesive paper that's really going to show all of the great things happening in your classrooms. So thanks for spending some time with me, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
much.